I am Jessica Parsons, and I'm going to look towards the camera when I say that because I learned from the lightning talk. And I'm here to tell you about lessons learned from a year in docs-driven development. A little bit about me. I am a documentation engineer at Netlify, which is a small company that's been around for a few years. That we're a platform for automating and deploying static sites and apps. So you might guess that I happen to be kind of a big nerd about docs as code and static site generators. Feel free to ask me about that stuff anytime. But you can also see some other things I've done about that. But we're going to talk about something different today. One thing to also mention, I am very thorough. That's my username. In Slack, on Twitter, on GitHub. So if you want to find me in any of those places, you can look there. I was pretty thorough about it. You can also find these slides online at slides.com/verythorough/DDD for docs-driven development -WTD. So before we get into this journey and the lessons, let's first talk about what am I even talking about? So what is documentation-driven development? Well, for something that isn't necessarily super simple, it is kind of simple to describe, which is, first, you write docs about the thing that you're going to make, and then you make the thing to match the docs that you wrote. So the idea is that you make the docs, and then you make the thing to match the docs. If you change what you're going to do, you change those docs, and then you change the thing after that. It also goes by some other names, sometimes with slightly different definitions. Also docs-driven design or README-driven development. You might have heard those terms as well. This was also a topic in the Write the Docs newsletter back in 2017. So it's been around for a while, long before 2017. I think I lost. No, I didn't. And it can take the form of a variety of things depending on how people are approaching it and what they're talking about. So it could include things like comments inside of code. It can also include spec files like, for example, Swagger or OpenAPI spec, if you're familiar with that. And then, of course, user-facing docs. So thinking about, now that we know what we're talking about, I'm going to tell about how we started, what we wanted to do, and how we got into deciding to do docs-driven development. Except I forgot this part. So very often when I talk about docs-driven development or when I read about it online, there are people who start asking, well, yeah, but isn't this just the same as some other thing? And one particularly grouchy person online said, well, you shouldn't be coming up with new names for all these things. DDD is already taken. It's, domain-driven development. And this is actually exactly the same as behavior-driven development. And so don't even bother using a new name for it. And if you're not familiar with behavior-driven development, which I wasn't either, it's the concept of writing what are basically behavioral tests more in human language, for what a software should do. So this is an example of something that's like that. And this person was saying, well, this is like your doc, right? This is not a doc. Like, is this a doc? No. Yes, it's written in English, but this isn't actually something that's useful to humans. So I would say no, this is not documentation-driven development. But another thing that people ask is, well, isn't this the same thing as user stories, or how is that different from that? And what about specifications? Is it the same thing as that? And I would say that partly, you can include user stories or specs as part of what would be the artifacts of your documentation that's driving your development. But there's more to it than that. It doesn't just stop there. And another thing that people will sometimes ask, isn't this just waterfall all over again? And are we just going back to the dark ages now? All this planning before we code is just going to be a problem. And I would say that it doesn't have to be. In fact, it can actually be more agile than not doing your documentation before, because the core of Agile is about iterating on the smallest possible change. And I can tell you that describing what something's going to do is a much smaller piece of work than actually coding the thing to do that thing. And so if you're iterating on documentation, then you're actually doing much smaller feedback cycles and working much more agilely than you would be if you just started in code and make the feature and then make the docs afterwards. So as we started this journey, we had a lot going for us, and I think it's kind of worth mentioning because there were things that sort of set us up to be perhaps a little bit more suited to doing this than other people, other teams. For example, we had strong leadership support. So our CEO, even before I started the company, knew about documentation-driven development, was a fan of README-driven development, would write READMEs of things before he made them on a flight to some conference that he had an idea that, oh, that's going to be our next feature, back when we were very small. And so that was one area where we had that coming from the top down as support for that. And our head of product, when she worked on the API team for the BBC, they also practiced documentation-driven development. She even wrote an article about it back in 2010. So you might not have those advantages. But we also had it beyond leadership, valued within the org. So generally speaking, people at our company value documentation and see the purpose of it and are willing to help with it. They weren't doing it before development before, but it was something that people were participating in already. And I would say that as a whole, they're also generally good communicators on the team. Half of us are remote, and many of us are in different time zones, so we actually have to do a lot of written communication anyway. And so this becomes an extension of that in a slightly more formalized manner. And so it seems like, okay, we've got a lot of advantages. This should be pretty smooth sailing for us. But maybe not entirely. First lesson, which was good intentions are not enough. So yeah, we said, okay, we're going to do docs. We want to do it. Nobody's like saying, oh, no, I don't want to do this. We're all good. But we have to actually do it, too. And we hit some issues along the way for doing that, because this is something new, and we're breaking old habits. And so some of the comments from people having gone through the process, we had things that I would hear along the way were, well, I'm not sure where to start. Or, I can explain things better visually than I can in writing. That came from one of our designers, as you might expect. And, oh, I keep forgetting that I need to write the docs first. So, yeah, that happens. You have habits from before. Someone from our API team said, I spent this last week really finding out about this feature and documenting it, and it was really valuable for me, but at the same time, I felt guilty for not getting more coding done, because that's what my job is measured on. And so there's that kind of a problem as well. So thinking about these things led to some things that we've learned and some things that we're changing or have changed. So one, imagine this, you should document the process. And if you really want to go whole hog on documentation-driven development, you might want to document the process that you're going to use so that you can use that to drive the process that you're going to use to drive your development with documentation. Because, that's what it's all about. So over time, when we started, we basically had the amount of our documentation of it was the explanation I gave on the second slide, which was write the docs first and then make the thing. And we're going to just kind of work from that process from there, partly because we were small and doing lots of things. But it also developed into, over time, project templates. So we have in our knowledge management system, which we're moving over to Notion this week, actually, that we started building templates for what a project would look like. And that would include required artifacts like, for example, user stories. Also something that we ended up calling names for all the things, and you can picture the little cartoon that's going, all the things. But and that we found that something that had happened later on that was it's important to have the common name for things. But when we did it early on in the process, it was actually really useful. So that we started a process that one of the artifacts in that is that we created a document that said, this is what all the things that are part of this feature are going to be called. Seems obvious, but was really useful. Another thing would be an example of a description of the workflow for interacting with the API for this feature. So internal documentation. And then, of course, things like customer-facing docs are also part of this. And then, so now we've got this system for putting all these things into, but the trouble is that writing is still hard when it's not something you do every day. It's hard sometimes when it is what you do all day. But providing scaffolding for people makes it easier for all the people who are involved in that documenting to help them be able to do that. Scaffolding is actually a term in educational psychology, which is the idea that when you're outside of your area that you can learn most easily, you provide scaffolding that gives that person that extra boost to get up to that next level of what they need to do. An example of how we did that is by giving docs templates to give structure and guidance for something. So that someone doesn't have to look at a blank page and wonder, where do I start and what do I do? My coworker Kristen made a wonderful template for our customer-facing docs drafting that includes common section headings, so things that you would probably have in your doc. Some parts you might not, some parts you might. And then within that, tips for how to approach those different, each section it has this cute little brain emoji with tips for how to use that one. And then also links to examples of that same sort of content elsewhere in the real docs. So things to help people get started and not just be working from a blank page. Another thing is to think beyond the written word. So documentation, as you already know, in regular public-facing documentation doesn't always have to be in writing, and that's the case also in the work that we do. And sometimes other media might serve the content better. It also might serve the author better. And so some examples of that would be diagrams, and we've had diagrams of what all of the different pieces of a feature, how they connect together within our system can be really useful for us as we're working through things. Wireframes are another traditional example that you might think of. And another one that we've been using more and more is video. And so being able to have that, and in some cases, for example, our designer who likes to think visually also likes to make videos. He has some pretty funny videos of his wireframes and designs. And then another thing is that the docs can't drive themselves. So yes, they're driving the development, but they still need a driver. So we found that we really need to designate a leader who can hold people to the process. So you need someone who, if you've forgotten to write the docs before you start coding, someone else can say, hey, did you write those docs yet? And that could be a full-time project manager. Up until this week, we did not have any full-time project managers. So one of the things that can also be in your team, if you don't have that sort of thing, is also a rotating project lead. And I would say make sure that that is something that rotates, because it's also important to make sure that your docs work counts, that people aren't going to want to spend time writing docs and doing things like that if they're being measured on how many lines of code they write or on other things that aren't like that. And Tanya Riley has done a talk about this, about the concept of glue work. It's that kind of work that gets done that is essential to things getting done, but you might not be seen as promotable for having done that work. It also happens to fall to women more often than men. So something to think about, make sure that it's distributed across your team, and make sure that it's something that counts and is promotable. So we got people writing docs, and something that we found from that is that early docs are useful even as they're being written. So before the doc is even finished, the process of writing that doc is useful. And so some of the treasures for that is that it identifies issues when investment is low. And that kind of comes back to what I was talking about being agile, that and with that investment, it's not just monetary investment from the time that's been spent, but it's also emotional investment, because when someone has put in a lot of time into developing something and then you look at it afterwards and you're like, this doesn't really make sense, they've already invested a lot in that and they don't really want to change it. So all sorts of investment are involved in there. And that when you're just talking about it before you've done all that work, people are much more receptive to change. And it can happen themselves. So as a developer writes about a feature, they can adjust their plans as they're writing. Discover, for example, when we were working on a feature for image transformation, the developer working on that, she found that when she got through the process of explaining how different people would authenticate with it, she said, this is going to be way too hard for the customer to do it the way that I've planned for it. I have to go back and change the way that we're doing this. And then it also happens when writers spot issues that can spark conversations. So as we were writing about with a feature, the sorts of query parameters that you could put into our URL to transform an image, we first had a plan for how that would work and that it would be really compact and simple, but then discovered that it was really difficult to explain. And you might know that when it's really difficult to explain something, that sometimes that means that that something might be better made in a different way. And it's really hard to have that conversation after the thing's already made. But before the thing's been made, that's a really productive conversation. And so we really had some great back and forth from that. So instead of going through and saying, oh, this is complicated, we should change it, and then just passing it to the next person, we had the conversation with the developer, and she said, okay, well, that is a good thing to do. We're also going to need this. So it was a back and forth. And that made it much more productive. And it leverages team expertise. And this is kind of a thing that is related to the naming things, the names for all the things doc, is that they say that naming things is one of the hardest things in programming. You might have heard that, the two hardest things. Well, maybe try delegating that to someone who writes for a living. And so, that's actually been really helpful for us, that we have someone from marketing and someone from docs working and thinking about the names for things and settling on names for things. And developers are actually really happy not to have to choose the names for things. They know what variables to pick, they know what things to choose, and they know that later on their variable is not going to mismatch from the word that we end up choosing to use in the doc, that's not going to mismatch from the word that ends up getting used inside of marketing. We can decide on that and have something that everybody's using the same language, and we can move from there. So writing the docs is a really valuable thing, but it's also a good idea to have people read them. And writing them doesn't necessarily guarantee that that's going to happen, as I'm sure you well know from public documentation. And it's the same thing when you're doing it to drive your development. So one comment I got from a developer was that I wrote a doc. I shared it in Slack. I asked everyone for comments, but I got crickets. So I'm not sure what to do about this. And I had someone else who said, I don't know when a doc has changed, and I can't tell what's new, so it's hard for me to know when I need to go back and look. And so these things are real problems, and it gets in the way of people wanting to make docs, and it gets in the way of people knowing what's going on with the docs as they're changing, because they're not set in stone. There's something that changes as development changes. So some tips for getting people to actually read the docs. One is to add accountability. So in this example from the last slide, I wrote a doc, I shared it in Slack, and I asked for comments. So that's a general request to everybody in the company. There's no deadline on it. And if there's no deadline and no specific person responsible, that's usually the kind of thing that people go, oh yeah, I should do that, but I'm never going to get around to it, and probably someone else will do it. And that's what everybody says, so then no one else does. So adding that accountability of specifying reviewers and timelines. So something that we're moving to now in our project template and developing our process is having specific points along the way where this is time to review this thing. We've made our user stories, and the different people who are on the team can look at that. So when you have one representative from each relevant team, so those might be, say, in the naming document, we had someone from marketing and someone from docs and someone from development to look at that and understand it and make sure that it's meeting everybody's different parameters. And so you have people that are, but it's just one person. It's not, oh, hey, marketing, could you take a look at this sometime? It's one person that's part of that team from the outset, and that their default review stages with deadlines, so that it's not just do it sometime when you get to it, it's in this sprint we're going to do this. And part of the sprint planning, like I mentioned. And then the other half of that is notifying people when they change. And we've tried to do some things with tooling for that. One that's kind of an obvious thing there is Git and GitHub. With PRs, we'll send people notification that you've made a change. You can go to that, you can see the diff to see exactly what changed, and that's all handy. However, we don't manage all of our planning documentation inside of Git because it's not the best thing for putting a bunch of rich text and other things into it in a plain markdown file. So we're using Notion for a lot of that now, and it has some updates built into it, but doesn't quite do all of the things that we need it to do yet, so we're kind of balancing between those things and haven't quite hit our sweet spot for what we want to do with that. But the way you can make up with that is handling it with humans instead of tools. So when it's time to review something, you file an issue, and we do use those for planning our work, and you can say, hey, here's an issue, this is updated, these people on this list, make sure you have a look at it by this time. And then you can announce changes that have been made along the way in a project channel. We keep project channels in Slack for all of our projects that we're working on. that becomes a specific group of people instead of the whole entire company. So we've got people writing the docs, we've got people reading them, or we're working on making them so that they can read them. And so what we found from that is that when teams do read the docs, they get really efficient. And it really does benefit their work. For example, when joining a project midstream. So one developer was talking about how she had to move into a project midway, and she said, I thought I would need to do a pairing to catch up. I thought, I'm coming in the middle, I'll schedule a pairing, we can talk about all the different parts, and she can get me caught up. But then she found that everything that she needed was already in the docs, and she could get that information on her own. And not only was that more efficient and quicker for her to do that, it also made her independent. And this is a really important thing to think about in making projects more inclusive, that when you're documenting things and people can find information on their own, that means they don't need to ask. That means that when they're doing that, it's not going to affect their imposter syndrome. It means that it's not going to make them think that, oh, because I asked, now they're going to think that everybody who looks like me is also not that smart at this thing. And so it's kind of an important thing to make it more and more possible for people to find this information on their own. So another thing that they can do is that different teams can work in parallel. When we've got a same page to work from and everybody's working from the same frame of reference, is that you can work together and not have to worry about waiting for this other thing along the line to get finished. There's still some of that, but as an example, that front end can develop against an API spec while the API builds the endpoints. So if the API team decides what their workflow is going to be like, and they write that up, that this is how you're going to make a call to this thing, and it'll come back to you, and they write the spec file for that. So if we use OpenAPI spec, and we haven't started doing this just yet, but we're about to. If they write the spec file for that endpoint and say, this is what the endpoint is, this is what the values are going to be returned, and all of those things, then front end can work against that endpoint before it's even been developed, and those two teams can work at the same time rather than in series. And another thing is that support can learn about the feature in depth in advance. So one of the things that we've struggled with over time is that we have support at the end finding out, oh, this feature's coming out and we don't quite know how to use it because we're launching it right after it finished and the docs are here and now we have to read and we have to catch up on it. We're also doing all these cases. And so we're starting to have an individual representative who comes from support from the start, and that person is involved in representing the customer, but also learning about that feature along the way, so that when the time comes, then they're the expert. They can train the other people in support, and different people on support specialize in different features because they've been through that. Another thing is that marketing can prep the messaging. I know that in some of our older features that we've done before, sometimes marketing was writing the blog post the day before the launch because marketing didn't actually know what the feature even did until the day before the launch. So knowing these things in advance makes that work more efficient and can also work in parallel. Developer relations can plan sample projects that use that technology. They can think about, what could I use this for? I can see these docs, I can think about how it's going to work. So we've got people writing the docs and they're reading the docs. And all of these things are good. We've got these projects that we've been working on and getting information, working more efficiently. But one thing to think about is that just because something is docs-driven doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's user-centered. It's one of the arguments for documentation-driven development, and it's one of the things that you're definitely more in the direction of that because you are thinking about what the user's going to be doing with it. But we had an instance where we developed a feature. We did the docs at the beginning. We talked about how it was going to work. We thought about, okay, we made user stories. This is what the user's going to do. This is how they're going to use the thing. I can't describe what it is because it hasn't been released. Because we got to a point where we opened it up just to us internally. And one of the members of our team runs an open source project for us, and it happened to be one of the things that he does every day represent the type of customer that we would actually want to be using this feature. And one of the first things he wanted to know is, well, how do I turn this off? Because it's really annoying. And it was supposed to be serving people like him. So that was kind of a wake-up call on, wait, we did all this stuff. We thought about how it would work, but we didn't think about what problem we were solving and why. So something to think about when you're doing that is that the docs aren't necessarily going to fix that. So don't forget to think of the users. Beware of function-focused user studies, stories. So if you're making user stories that are saying, I want to be able to do the thing that I'm already planning for people to be able to do because I want to be able to do those things. Like, if it's very functional, then think about the problem you're actually solving behind that. And then get users involved sooner. So that's something that we're working on doing. And then also in places where you can't get users involved sooner to test or to read those docs that you've written, that can be a really lightweight way for a user to give you feedback on something. But also enlist customer-facing teammates as proxies for your users. So we're getting support involved at a very early stage. So we're working on something to improve part of our billing. And the support person who specializes in dealing with billing problems for our customers is helping write those user stories. And we know that those user stories are valid user stories because the users wrote them in support tickets. So that has been very valuable. Community managers, our community support forum, is also another place where we can have information from what the customers need and what they use. Developer advocates, sales can also provide that information. When you can't get the customer, get those people involved. So at the end of it all, school is still in session. So this has definitely been a successful thing for us. I definitely will not say that we've moved entirely from docs or it didn't happen to docs or it won't happen. There are still things that are getting made before documentation has been made. But what we found is that the things that are problems with the system are not something that makes us not want to do documentation-driven development. It's basically we need to double down on it, and that we need to do it more, and making that will make the rest of the system work better. So if you'd like to find out more about it, you can follow me on Twitter. I plan to write a bunch of blog posts about what we've done so far and what we're doing in the future. And the fact that I set it up here makes me actually write them. So I'd love to have the conversation with you here and elsewhere as well. So thank you.